Okay, I admit I am a dirty, rotten, stinking liar. I'm doing another music, quote unquote, career thing so soon after the last one. Because even with last week's, honestly, probably too lengthy episode, I still didn't cover everything that I wanted. And chief among those things would be the multitracks for Greetings from Elderbush Gulch. But Greetings is just one of those things that I could almost write a book about it, or at least devote a few chapters to it. But anyway, I mentioned a few times in last week's episode what a mess the sessions and, in the end, the recordings were for the album. But given the aforementioned runtime of that episode, I opted not to dig into it. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to sit here casually at the computer, and I guess I should explain my setup here. This is actually my camcorder just pointed at the computer screen. And this is because I can do a fully internal voiceover and playback of existing tracks, but I don't have anything that will allow me to monitor it. So if I want to monitor it, I have to run it out separately. And in the end, it's just easier for me to do the camcorder thing. So anyway, we've got a copy of the audio running out from the computer to my Zoom H4n, which will find its way into the episode. Now, what we've got on screen here is a preliminary thing, which I'll discuss more in a minute. And after that, we're going to take a look at 4 tracks from this album, 2 of which are just the basic tracks, the basement session. One will be of the 2006 Studio Lodo sessions, the overdubs, the version that got released initially, and one of my remix from 2011. Anyway, otherwise all I can say is grab your headphones, kids, because you're gonna need them today. So the basic tracks for Greetings were recorded on a 16-track, 8-input Yamaha workstation. The overdubs were done, the Studio Lodo sessions were done on Pro Tools, probably Pro Tools 7. And as I mentioned in last week's episode, when I finally got a copy of the raw tracks from the basement session, the CDs did not read. And amazingly, I kept them all these years. I was using them as packing material in my box of master tapes. But I figured just for the hell of it, I've got a few more CD drives now. I'll just pump them into all of them and see if any of them will take any of the discs. And amazingly, one of my drives, the cheapest, most generic one, took one of those CDs. So I was finally able to see what was going on there. And so that's the top pair of tracks here. And the bottom pair are of the second set of CDs that I got. And those are what were used, obviously, for overdubs and for the final album. Now, I don't think there's any difference in terms of sound between these. Obviously, the volume levels are a little different. But what I did for purposes, all intents and purposes today, is I've tried to level them out so they sound the same at least. So if you look at the top 2 tracks again, if I zoom out, you'll notice that it was all done as one big long track. Now I know we recorded more than this, but I guess that if we did something that we didn't finish, then we would just delete back to that point in the recording. I'm still not too sure what actually happened there. I was more concerned about the music itself. I was kind of taking the technical part of it on faith. But let me zoom back in here. Now, these top 2 were actually initially a single stereo track. I've split them for this. And this is the kick and the hi-hat. And let's just play a bit of the kick. I didn't know a kick could fart until this point. And if I switch over to the other version, you'll hear it's the same. The hi-hat was done a little better, but you already heard in the kick that there was some bleed going on, and that was partially because we were in close proximity, but also because there were some routing issues that I wasn't aware of till much later on. So let's just give you a bit of the hi-hat here. And now my vocal is in the hi-hat. And down here it should be the same. Now that proved to be a definite issue later on, but I'll get into that. And otherwise, now that you've seen what the truly raw stuff looked like, let's take a look at a couple songs where we've got all those raw basic tracks put together. Alright, we've got the song Mean Woman Blues pulled up here, and you can see we used all 8 inputs for the workstation. We got a vocal, guitar, bass, snare, kick, 2 overheads, and I know it's labeled as tom, but it's actually hi-hat, and there is no hi-hat on this song, so I've got that muted. Now, I made a bit of a boo-boo in last week's episode, or at least something I didn't clarify too well. I mentioned that at least one song on the album had the bass being just a wash of low-pitched feedback. And that is true, but it's not necessarily on the bass track. So let's pull that up here. So the feedback happens, but in this case, it's on the vocal track. And I should note that the bass was recorded direct in, straight into the board, so you could only hear the bass if you were wearing headphones. So, in spite of that, some really terrible routing was going on that I still have no idea what was going on, but this is what I was referring to with low-pitched feedback. And that happens a few times during this big, long instrumental stretch. And he's not holding a note. The bassist is not holding a note there. It just starts feeding back in my vocal track for some reason. And funnily enough, the bass doesn't have the feedback problem, but my vocal somehow wound up in the bass track. I mean, that's some real pretty reverb, but it's not intentional. Okay, now let me note here that this was the one song on the album that I wanted to do completely live in the studio. And it's just a standard 12-bar blues. I mean, it is super easy. And I don't know what this says about my guitar playing, but every time I would start to take my solo, even with them knowing that it was supposed to be 3 rounds of the 12-bar blues, the band would just completely fall apart. And since we were trying to get all this done very quickly, these were all done in one day. And I think in a span of about 5 hours, I was like, you know what, I'll just overdub a solo later. We got to get through this. So I just kept playing rhythm through that stretch just to try and keep everybody together. That was the only way I could hold the band together. Now, I also want to note one thing here that I found amusing at the time and built it into the final album, the final release. If we pick out just, it's heard the most on the right overhead track. The drummer completely missed the ending here. So what happened was it was supposed to end in a crescendo, and the bassist and I did it, but the drummer just was nowhere to be found. So we did another one trying to get him to hop on, And he did, very, very briefly. But afterwards, you can hear him say something, his complete misinterpretation of what's going on, and his misinterpretation of the lyric, which is a piss take anyway. The whole song's kind of a piss take. It wasn't meant to be taken seriously. But let me play the last, 15, 20 seconds of this one, and we'll isolate it to just the right overhead track. So I thought that was hilarious. And unfortunately, you can hear that it just cuts off. That's the moment where the bassist hit stop on the Porta Studio. And to try and cover that up in the final release, I just put a big nasty guitar chord over it for my now necessarily overdubbed guitar solo. I just thought it was too good not to have there. So yeah, I don't know what that says. We're too depressed to make it through this blues or something. I think it's funny. Anyway, let's take a look at the other track to be recorded in this configuration. Okay, this is the other song recorded in this configuration. Same three guys and electric guitar based. And this one had, even by my standards, a bad vocal. And so that had to be redone. And this was, you could tell this was much later in the day because my voice is just starting to give out.
You got something that belongs to me. Those are the words I said. I took the money and put a bullet in his head.
So obviously that had to be fixed. And I wound up having to redo the bass on this one as well because it clips. And you can see there's plenty of headroom, but it was clipping apparently in the board. And obviously I wasn't aware of this until I got the final set of raw tracks. So that was one thing I had to do. And I was so new to the bass that it's kind of spazzy. But you'll hear why this could not be used. So that was something to take care of on top of everything else. And let's see what else here. The last song, Mean Woman Blues. I shouldn't have zoomed out. Mean Woman Blues had a botched ending. This one has a botched ending too, but that one was humorous. This one I didn't think was so funny, but it made me get creative with what to do with it. So this one was supposed to end in a crescendo, just as Mean Woman Blues was supposed to. So it was supposed to be ba-da-ba, ba-da-ba, and then crescendo on that and end. But the drummer, as you can see here, just kept on going. So it made me get creative in both in the 06 and 11 versions. And let me just play this before I finish discussing that. So let me kill the vocal track since there's nothing there. So what I wound up doing was fading out that extra drum work and cranking up the reverb on the overall track, giving it kind of a crash and burn feeling. And it was okay on the 06 version, but by 11 I'd figured out how to really crank it and make it crank to the point where the only way it was going to fade out is if I faded it out. It's just an explosion this time. And I decided to just let it keep ringing. And when I was assembling the final CD, I just let another 10-15 seconds of it very quietly spill into the next song, Ice Blue Eyes. So if you're ever listening with headphones and you're listening real carefully, you can still hear this song ringing out well into the intro of Ice Blue Eyes. So just a little bonus there. All right, let's jump ahead to one from the Studio Lodo sessions. Still 2006, but now with overdubs. Okay, we've got Come Hell or High Water pulled up here, and this is fairly representative of what most of the multi-tracks for this album look like. Most of them only had 2 or 3 overdubs per song. Of course, there's exceptions, operative word, most. And the overdubs and 2 new songs were recorded completely, all in 2.5 days, with me playing everything. The album was mostly mixed in a day and a half, although we went back sometime later and had a few more hours and polished things a little. But they're still kind of unfinished here. Like, for some reason, the vocals are not, the ones that have the live vocals, are not muted during the instrumental stretches. So that's a little extra bleed going on there. And unfortunately, the processing, for the most part, has not carried over to this. This is Pro Tools 10 that I'm using here. I think it was done on Pro Tools 7. But aside from this reverb plugin, which I think is just on the lead guitar and a bit on the vocal, perhaps, that's all we've got. But as you can see, all the plugins are grayed out, inactive, so this is going to be pretty dry. For the lead guitar, I guess you could say we went a little overboard with it. We had a D4 in the front, a Rode NT2 in the back, and then another track going direct into the board, and then we just blended them all together. But they definitely stand out. This is, because we had to mix so fast, you can really tell what was overdubbed and what was part of the original sessions. So, let's see, the other overdub would have been keyboards, organ, and piano. Everything was done in one shot, at least on this song, and I think that's representative of most of them. You can tell there's no lines, there's no slices in here. This is what I actually played in real time. Unfortunately, Studio Lodo did not have any keyboards, and certainly not any real keyboard instruments like a piano or something, so the keyboards on this album are all still from my old Yamaha keyboard that I used on my bedroom stuff years earlier. And it kind of sounds it. So we'll just let the piano intro here happen. Okay, we got that. And the organ... Unfortunately, this Pro Tools is glitchy on this OS I'm using. But we'll solo the organ. Oh, there was one edit. I must have screwed something up there. Now, the only real problem on this track, unfortunately, we just were not in a place to fix at the time. I did what I could with it when I remixed it, but you can hear, if I can aim my mouse right, there's the bridge, and the drummer was supposed to hit along with each new line, and he's lagging here, so let me play that.
I know you think I'm crazy, all my ideas are just schemes. You can walk away, I've got to follow my dreams.
So that was some interesting rhythm there, and he tried to launch into the instrumental 2 beats early, even though it was still straight 4/4 time. Oh well. Okay, last song. This is the 2011 remix of Settling the Score. And I just want to show you kind of what I was doing during the remix process here. So, still got that. And let's start with the vocal. We'll start at the top. This is one of the ones where I had to redo the vocal. And for some reason, I did not fade it out during the instrumental bits. Oh well. But one thing I'm not entirely sure of is this first verse. Now, bear in mind, these are all the same vocal. They're just copies of it. But for some reason, I guess I wanted different processing or something, but this is its own entity. So you hear this on playback, you do not hear that. But anyway, another thing that I did was I wanted the vocal to be a little stronger, so I decided to try and double track it, do a tape delay style double track, but there was nothing in the plugins that I liked. So I just made a copy and I threw it out of sync and adjusted the volume to my own taste. And I found myself doing that for years to come afterward. I guess I just never found anything I liked with the plugins on that front. But anyway, let's isolate the vocal here, vocals, and see what we get.
Well, the days are getting longer, and I'm not getting any stronger. Well, I could tell you 1,000 lies I might tell.
Okay, so that was meant to fit in with the acoustic guitar to match the bleed that was occurring during that point.
Well, the days are getting longer, and I'm not getting any stronger. Well,
okay. So let's jump ahead a bit and we can hear the transition between vocal tracks. And this will now be its own final version and more of a traditional sounding tape delay sort of effect.
yeah, I know she's gotta be around here somewhere. Well,
Okay, so we'll do that with the band now.
I would try. Well, where's my lady with the night black hair? I know she's gotta be around here somewhere. Well,
So that's also where I wanted it to be more dynamic. That was something that got very much lost in the original mix. And one other just stupid thing at the end of the vocal, for whatever dumb reason, I decided to let out a little yeah at the end of the vocal stretch here. And it's pretty dorky, and you can't hear it in the original mix, but I decided to bring it forward for this. So let's play that.
war.
Yeah. Guess I thought I was Neil Diamond for a second. So just one of the many quirky things that I do. And this was one of the songs that I had to redo the bass on. And it wasn't an ego thing. I was not setting out to redo the bass. Believe me, if I didn't have to do it, I wasn't going to. I had too much to worry about. So in this case, the original was really, really bad. And I think just straight up in the wrong key at times. Now, I hadn't really played bass up until this point, but somebody had to do it. So I wound up just trying it, and it just wound up being this spastic kind of thumping thing. But I think I was trying to match up against the drums. Not the tightest thing in the world still. Now, we had the snare isolated there as well, and despite all the natural reverb and the mixed up processing, the wrong routing that was occurring in the original tracks, I decided to add a bunch of extra reverb to this, more for a gunshot sound, I guess, and also because I think it made it feel a little more urgent. I wanted the song to feel more urgent than it did originally, so there's just the snare. And we'll let the band come back in.
With the night black hair, I know she's gotta be around here somewhere. Well, when's my chance?
And of course, the reverb thing was just a big issue throughout. And in this case, on the remixes in general, I just had to add a lot of reverb to almost everything so it would all match up against the live band tracks, because everything just stood out like a sore thumb otherwise. And since I was already talking about the drums there, the drums are not honest on this one. This is one of the songs that had a bad case of lagging band syndrome. So the drums were resynced. So this is actually a little farther back in time than it actually was. But otherwise, it was my acoustic guitar leading the charge again. And it was prominent enough already, and I didn't want to have to force it anymore. So I just redid it. And I didn't want to George Lucas the album. That's a verb now, by the way. In that I would be reimagining it and kind of tampering with history, so to speak. So I decided to draw the line at just resyncing, but not doing the full-on grid thing and trying to make it technically perfect. Because I'm one of those nuts that thinks that a record means not just a physical product, but a record of that point in time. So I wanted to, messy as it is, keep that kind of garage band flavor going that I had. So again, the drums are not naturally occurring here. And also the drummer missed the crash a couple of times. He was supposed to hit the crash coming in at the band entrance. He didn't. So I had to cut and paste it from another point in the song. And if I isolate it, it sounds absolutely terrible. So I'll play that. However, if we play it with everything else, the night black hair, I know she's gotta be around us some. It works. And he missed it going into the instrumental section, so I had to use the same one a second time. And then he hit the crash on the wrong beat there, but there just wasn't much I could do about that without it sounding really bad. And if we jump up here, you can see where I had to do a little stitching. This was supposed to have a similar bridge to Come Hell or High Water, where the drummer was supposed to hit with each new phrase. But it didn't happen quite right, and in this case, you can tell right near the end of it that I had to do a little dinking around with it. Breaking loose, and I can find a way to shake these blues as well. It's about time I got my share. Okay, let's, since we're in rhythm land here, let's do the kick, because this was one thing that I had to process the ever-loving hell out of. Really inconsistent. You heard the whole farting kick thing earlier that I was, having a little fun with. So there's the kick track, and it took all this processing to make it worthwhile. And actually, it's not all engaged. I used a tape saturator plugin on this, but I'm just using the freebie version, which doesn't save it. So I'd have to find my session notes to put it back. I think it wasn't too radical. I think it was something like that. We'll just see what we get there for the kick. Anyway, let's do the kick, and I'll just kind of peel off as much of the processing as I can. So we're back into farting kick territory. I had the Joe Meek Meequalizer on here. We'll just throw that out. We'll just throw everything that I can out. Yeah, it's a pretty dull thud, isn't it? And I think you're seeing why it took me something like 6 weeks to remix this album. It was just such a problem. And otherwise, that is pretty much it. Oh, I can think of one more thing that I did. So on the songs that have organ, if I can find it, there we are. I thought it sounded too narrow initially. I couldn't really make it stand out. So what I did was, it was a real stereo track, but I split it into mono, panned it out left and right, and threw the tracks out of phase to try and make it seem a little more wide. And it wound up being serendipitous because it also made it sound a little more real. I mean, this is just my Yamaha keyboard, but it does kind of sound like an actual Leslie speaker now. All right, so that's really everything I wanted to cover here today. Hopefully, you have a little more of an understanding of how this all came together and what I had to go through to try and make it work. And really, even though I still don't look back on this time too fondly, since I've been working on this installment of the whole music career thing, I'm kind of surprised at myself. I'm amazed that one, I was actually able to get the thing finished, but also that it holds together as well as it does. I mean, that's kind of a small comfort, but uh, you know, I guess I could call it something of a minor, unqualified success. And that was something, especially at 20 years old and not having a whole lot of resources. So I guess I should look back on it a little better than I do. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed the context. Hopefully you enjoyed this little spin through the multi-tracks. And I promise I'll start doing proper archive again next week. I'll see you then.